Women have never been absent from combat or war itself, and while their roles have been predominantly relegated to auxiliary positions, they have also been present on the front lines in battles and conflicts throughout human history. Women served in vital parts of the military structure for both the Axis and the Allied forces during World War II, working in a variety of official and unofficial positions, including administration, medical, reconnaissance, communication, and transport. Others fought as members of resistance and partisan groups, while only the Soviet Union allowed women to serve on the front lines of combat. Over the 6 years of the Second World War, a small number of the brave women who fought for their nations were captured and became prisoners of war and were subjected to some of the most severe and dangerous experiences on record. Welcome to History Decoded, and today, we will examine the untold stories of captured female soldiers during World War II. The Soviet Union suffered the highest number of deaths of any military during the Second World War, losing around 9 million total. Of the lives lost, about 500,000 were women. With the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the Nazis had broken the non-aggression pact between the Russians and Germans and kicked off Operation Barbarossa, a brutal three-pronged attack that would quickly become a fatal, long-term military campaign claiming the lives of millions of civilians and soldiers. Upon hearing the Soviet Union was to be invaded, Soviet women flooded recruiting offices alongside their fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, boyfriends, and friends, demanding the opportunity to serve Mother Russia against the Germans. Many would work as nurses, couriers, radio operators, and other personnel throughout the war, but got the chance to serve on the front lines. Although Russia was initially hesitant to allow women to the front lines, the necessity for soldiers and the heavy losses they suffered would require all able-bodied Russians, regardless of sex, to be eligible and prepared to fight for their country. The Soviet Union was the only military in the world that permitted men and women to serve alongside one another in equal roles and recognized men and women as complete equals, training them to fight next to each other and work in integrated units beside one another. The Germans were infuriated by such a prospect and would treat the Soviet military women as they did the men, viciously and swiftly. The Russians had a history of pride, a devotion to the motherland, and any failure was seen as a gross dishonor. This was the mindset of the Soviet soldier, male or female. Serve the Soviet Union to the best of your ability and do not fall into the wrong hands. In many cases, one's job was to kill as many Germans as possible before they had the chance to kill you. And to die was a far greater honor than the disgrace of capture. To become a prisoner and not escape was an egregious failure, and for many Russians, it was the worst fate of any soldier. Over the course of the war, some of the best sharpshooters were Soviet women, serving alongside men and acquiring some of the highest kill records in the war. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, known as Lady Death, had a prestigious 309 confirmed kills, and following her recovery from injuries, became an ambassador for the Russians to plead their case for the Americans to start a Western or Southern front to draw focus from the Eastern Front. Her sister-at-arms, sniper and radio operator Tatiana Baramzina gave her life in the summer of 1944 trying to protect her fellow soldiers. Baramzina had chosen to stay with the wounded hiding in a dugout with casualties than escape. Following being injured by a grenade, the Germans dragged her out by her hair after executing her comrades. They kicked her, stabbed her with their bayonets, struck her repeatedly with the butts of their rifles, and then killed her with a shot to the head from an anti-tank rifle. Sniper Natalia Kovshova was wounded during a skirmish with the Nazis near Novgorod and knew becoming a prisoner was not an option. She and her friend, fellow sniper Maria Polivanova, had killed over 300 that day and had very little time to set their trap. After pulling the pins out from a grenade, they waited for the Germans to enter their trench. Once the Nazis had begun to flood the trench, Polivanov and Kovshova set off the grenades, killing themselves and injuring or killing a number of Germans as well. Evidence has shown that many of the tens of thousands of female Soviet soldiers who were captured are quickly executed before they could assess the situation, with a fair number brutalized at the hands of their captors, being raped, beaten, and tortured before being put to death. Some data suggests many were sent to concentration camps and would be gassed, hanged, or shot upon arrival, and others would perish from illness, forced labor, or starvation in the camps. The female Soviet soldiers who survived have, if ever, rarely spoken about their time in the concentration camps or prisons, leaving little behind on their treatment at the hands of the Germans following their capture. There is little information on female prisoners of war from the Soviet Union, as many bodies were never found, most likely buried in mass graves after capture and execution. The resistance movements against the Nazis were embedded throughout the occupied territories, working in conjunction with the Allied forces in Britain and the United States to undermine the German authorities. Relaying messages, moving explosives, aiding Allied soldiers behind enemy lines, publishing pamphlets and newspapers, forging travel documents and identification, and recording troop movements. The women of the resistance were essential for the Allied success against the Nazis. They became essential during the war, and some endured horrific experiences. Noor Inayat Khan, a Russian-born Indian Muslim, was the first female radio operator sent to France by the Special Operations Executive, or the SOE. She escaped France shortly after falling to the Nazis and signed up with the Women's Auxiliary Force before being recruited to the SOE. As she was fluent in French and had worked on the Paris radio before as part of her career of writing children's stories, she became an asset. After extensive training, she was dropped into occupied France to serve as a clandestine broadcast operator, along with two comrades on June 16, 1943. She posed as a children's nurse and used her position to gather intel, moving throughout occupied France and trying to stay hidden by changing her looks and moving around frequently. Despite her efforts, Khan was detained and taken to be interrogated. She made 2 attempts to escape, and while she was successful once, she was quickly recaptured and tortured for information. She was kept in solitary confinement and beaten daily, but she refused to speak about why she was there. After failing to uncover her mission, Khan was sent to Dachau concentration camp to spend the rest of her time there, enduring starvation, beatings, and forced labor. In the fall of 1944, she and 3 other SOE agents were executed by firing squad. One of the most famous women of the French resistance was Germaine Tillion. An anthropologist and ethnographer, helped to organize early resistance efforts based out of the Musée de l'Homme. Building a partnership with other partisan sects, Tillion was able to map out the weak areas in the demarcation line, the division line between occupied France and the Vichy regime, providing invaluable information to the resistance of points where people could easily pass without needing specialty papers from the Germans. Her resistance faction was responsible for sabotaging many German transportation routes and arranging for papers and safe houses for Jews, Allied airmen who had been shot down, escaped prisoners of war, and political enemies of the Nazi. Despite the careful planning and vetting of allies, Tillion and several of her comrades were betrayed by a double agent. Tillion was arrested and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp to serve out the remainder of the war, and with a bit of luck and determination, she managed to survive years of severe beatings, hard labor, and malnourishment, and saw the liberation of the camp in early 1945. Polish-born Sabine Chwast-Zlatan, a Jewish nurse who worked for the French Red Cross, worked as a nurse on for the French during the start of the war and later at a prisoner camp. She focused on her work, trying to help the wounded and sick in the vile conditions of the camp, and formed a plan to rescue children from the detainee center. Zlatan teamed up with a female doctor, some older children, her husband, teachers, locals, and several nurses, and together managed to rescue hundreds of children from the detention camps at Agde and Rivesaltis. She and her husband cared for the health and well-being of the children at an abandoned sanatorium before sending them to their new families. She arranged for 17 of the children who had been overlooked by the guards at the camp to reach the safety of the Alps. In the winter of 1944, Zlatan and her work was discovered, and under the orders of infamous SS Commander Klaus Barbie, the operation was viciously shut down. 7 of her 8 compatriots were captured. The other managed to escape. All of the children present at the sanatorium were sent to a concentration camp. None of them would survive. Zlatan was taken to Montpellier, where she was beaten until all of her teeth were broken and her face was bleeding violently. She was interrogated for hours over her involvement in the scheme to rescue children. Miraculously, she managed to escape when she managed to slip out of the building she was being held. After asking a soldier if she could go to a bar across the street to get some brandy to help stop her nosebleed. When she was allowed to do so, she went through the cafe, out the back door to an alley, and fled to safety. She survived the remainder of the war, testifying against Barbie at his trial and helping to convict him of the murders of the 44 children and 7 adults who had perished at his command. Reba Whittle had the distinction of being the only woman of the American military to have been a prisoner of war in the European theater. Serving as a flight nurse, Whittle had been on the front lines helping to evacuate wounded Allied personnel back to Britain for medical care in the transport, a Douglas C-47 Skytrain. Between January and September of 1944, Whittle and her crew were some of the most well-trained and experienced staff to rescue the injured. On what would have been like any other flight on September 27th, Whittle's transport was carrying vital supplies and cargo into the Belgian countryside near Saint-Trond, when, inexplicitly, the Skytrain wound up about 90 kilometers off course, ending up well inside German airspace over the city of Aachen. Because they were not carrying any wounded and were not designated as a medical flight, the aircraft was quickly set upon by Nazi anti-aircraft fire. The plane was promptly hit and fell rapidly out of the sky, crashing to the ground in a terrible wreck as one of the two aviators was killed in the barrage, while the co-pilot and Whittle were injured. The surviving crew managed to escape the remains, but due to their injuries, they were swiftly captured by German soldiers. After being treated for her injuries, Whittle and her comrades was transferred to a hospital in the prisoner of war camp Stalag 9C and was allowed to work as a nurse there when she had recuperated. The Germans, still unsure of what to do with her, contacted the Red Cross to inform them of Whittle's capture. She was released in early January of 1945 and was sent back to the United States to recover. Despite the incredible bravery of many of these women, few were officially acknowledged for their efforts or the sacrifices they made over the course of the war. Many survivors returned to their day-to-day life, retired from the military or resistance movements, and focused on building a new life for themselves as mothers and wives. Some moved out of country in pursuit of new opportunities, and others could not escape the battle and instead joined other partisan groups to combat the Soviet forces, such as in occupied Poland, Romania, and Hungary. In 1950, Whittle appealed the military's decision to refuse her military retirement, as they did not deem her PTSD or recurring headaches as related to service, even though she had no record of any symptoms prior to being injured in 1944. She eventually won her appeal and obtained her military retirement and benefits, although she did not get any of the backdated funds she would have gotten when she first applied. Her husband tried for decades that she would be recognized as a POW, and in 1997, 14 years after the Army recognized the nurses who had been captured in the Philippines, Whittle posthumously received the Medal for Prisoners of War. Thank you for watching the untold stories of captured female soldiers in World War II here on History Decoded. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Feel free to leave a comment below about other topics we should cover. Thank you again, and until next time, this is History Decoded.